I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Software Spotlight, your front row seat to the latest innovations in software for small business. I'm Michael Burnswide, your host, and each week we are joined by executives at leading software companies to get an insider's perspective on the emerging technologies, business strategies, and market trends shaping the future. Tune in to stay ahead of the curve on leveraging software to boost productivity and growth in your business. Be sure to visit our website, softwareoasis.com, to access our free weekly software newsletter and sign up for our upcoming 2024 software webinar series. This week, we're joined by Kieron James. He's an entrepreneur and founder of Wonderful, an innovative fintech company providing secure, instant bank payments at no cost. With over 30 years' experience launching startups in tech, including having been acquired by two NASDAQ listed companies, James brings exceptional expertise. His new venture, Wonderful, aims to transform payments and fundraising via open banking. James joins us today to discuss this cutting edge innovation in fintech. So, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Michael. Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, wonderful. I know a lot of things have changed in the banking arena over the last few years, and nothing as dramatic as what we're about to talk about today. So I think this is really exciting for a lot of our listeners who always like to keep up on the latest in tech and the like. Can you tell us a little bit about Wonderful Payments and the solution, and what um, what brought you to the point where you introduced the solution to the market? What need did you say?
Absolutely. Let me do that. I might take those actually in reverse order and talk about what brought us here, because it was
Sure.
actually in solving a problem that we'd encountered, that had arisen really through the high cost of processing payments and increasingly high cost of processing payments. So, if you will, let me turn back the clock to 2016, and then we'll kind of wind forward quite rapidly.
Sure. No, that's helpful.
But in 2016, I was involved in running a telecoms business. And as a completely pet project, side project, we often call it the side hustle without the hustle because we were doing this for a philanthropic concern that we'd set up. We decided we had the harebrained idea of building a completely free online charity giving platform. So that idea was sparked by my son, who was doing a parachute jump for a teenage cancer charity. And he came downstairs one evening completely frustrated because he discovered that a big chunk of the money that he was raising was going to be lost to various intermediaries along the way between him and the charity. So this kind of really spawned the idea for, can we create something that will solve that problem and ensure that the charities get every penny from those kind of fundraising efforts? And that's how Wonderful, in its first guise, got started. So wonderful.org was born, and we created this fundraising platform. And the model for funding that platform was actually corporate sponsorship. So we initially, as the telecoms business, said we'll fund the first £1 million that gets raised through the platform, and then we'll look for a corporate sponsor with deeper pockets. And that took a bit of time, but along the way, we got one of the high street banks to come along and be our main corporate sponsor. But what we found was, as that platform's popularity grew, we just had kind of this linear relationship between the amount of donations that we were processing and the cost of getting that money to the charities. So we started to look for a solution because we thought, actually, this is creating this really low ceiling on our impact and reach. We can only grow so large and reach as many charities and fundraisers as donors as card processing allows us to reach. And long story short, kind of along the way, COVID happened. We paused the platform. We had a look around at solutions, and
Sure.
one presented itself in the form of open banking. So let me tell you a little about open banking and how that works. What basically happened when we discovered open banking was that we found a method of moving the donor's money from their account to the charity's account in one tap on a mobile phone, or a couple of clicks on a laptop, And essentially, that money was moved directly from that account into the charity's account with only one intermediary rather than several intermediaries. So it was basically a bank to bank transfer, but a super simple, very secure, and immediate transfer with a fraction of the costs associated with cards. And essentially, that's what open banking is.
So it's essentially done through the traditional banking network versus through a credit card processing network, which has obviously a lot of other intermediaries.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And when we think about debit cards and credit cards, I mean, credit cards in the UK were introduced 60 years ago for an entirely different world. They're actually, funnily enough, as old as I am. So not quite 60, but 58 years ago in the UK. And
Yeah,
if you think about the world we're operating in now with e-commerce and so on, it's a technology that was created for an entirely different purpose.
absolutely, absolutely. So I would think that a lot of companies must be exploring this technology, or are you way ahead in terms of the market at this point?
I think it depends very much on the country that you're in and in a sense, the regulatory framework, because what really needs to happen for open banking to succeed is I think you need a regulatory stimulus for it, because clearly there's a lot of interest in the status quo, commercial drivers for that, and for maintaining as many transactions through debit and credit cards as possible.
Sure, no,
There are
that
a
makes a
lot
lot of
of
sense.
intermediaries taking a share of those transactions.
So what is it that was your background in banking, prior to this? Like what I know you had two companies that you had mentioned were sold to NASDAQ traded companies,
So going back even further, my background in terms of businesses, it's not banking. I've been involved in a number of different areas, but
right?
all I would describe as ICT, information communication technology, in a broad sense.
Sure.
Um, Going right back to 1998, which was when I got involved probably in the first business. Prior to that, I'd been in education as a high school teacher and running a training institute out in the Middle East.
Got it.
Um, and I got asked to put together some marketing materials for the Training Institute and decided that a website might be a good approach. In 1998, it felt like the right time to be starting to think about that kind of thing.
Sure.
Uh, got initially involved in web design, then found the whole creative process was actually, it's typically quite a long time from winning a client to getting paid. There'll be a lot of modifications to the design work that's going on. So I started to look at opportunities where there were higher levels of automation, I guess looking broadly in a broadest sense, at software as a service. So we were involved in things like online company formations back in 1999, which was very early to be doing that kind of thing. I remember building websites that were using Perl scripts and one long form to gather all the information for a company formation.
Right.
So not the best user friendly experience that you'd anticipate seeing today, but certainly did its job very, very well. We also got involved early on in domain name registration because, again, that was a process that we could build an integration with network solutions as it was back in the day, or Nominet in the UK, so the domain registrars, and we would register domain names in a fairly automated process too. Um, from there, it was providing technical solutions in telecoms, typically aimed at small businesses. So I'm thinking now, probably around 2005, we were putting together call management systems that were delivered through an online interface to allow you to route calls to a cell phone, or to fax to email, voice to email, all of those kinds of solutions. So typically, it's always been around finding something that we can build, and that we can make that user experience, as simple and streamlined as possible.
So can you give an example of, so that people listening can understand clearly what a transaction would look like through a traditional payment system like a MasterCard or a Visa or Discover card versus through open banking? What are the differences from fees, from, the way it flows through the system?
Let me do that, and I'll do it from two perspectives. And I think it's quite important to understand the two perspectives. So, from a consumer's point of view, imagine you're an e-commerce environment. Typically, what we'll see is you'll get to checkout and you'll be asked to enter a card number. That's usually 16 digits, and you'll be asked for a CVV and an expiry date and the first name on or the name on the card, and perhaps the zip code for your card.
Sure.
And then you'll enter all of that information and your payment will be processed. Now, again, what we're seeing, and I'm sure it's the same in the US as well, but what we're seeing now is increasing levels of security around that process because we're trying to reduce the amount of fraud. So what you might see now is with transactions over a certain value, you're asked to enter a one-time password that might have been sent to you via an SMS message. What we're seeing increasingly in the EU and the UK is that those kinds of verifications of the payment are actually being sent and confirmed through your mobile banking app, through your cell phone banking app.
Sure.
Now, so from a point of view of getting you through a checkout, that's quite a lengthy process, and also is open to data being misentered, data being compromised, all sorts of things, because you're basically sharing that data with a number of different people along the way, along that journey.
Makes
It's
sense.
also can be quite a lot of friction in that process because there's a lot of data to enter, so it can be quite slow. And then you're being sent off somewhere else to verify that that payment is being made by you. So that's the consumer perspective. And again, let me give you the open banking alternative to that from the consumer's point of view. In an open banking payment, essentially you'll skip all of those first steps. So there's no 16-digit number, there's no CVV, there's no zip code, there's no first and last name of the card holder. You're taken basically to the very next step, that confirmation of the payment. And what will happen is you'll do that confirmation in an environment that you're super familiar with, very confident about using because it's your mobile banking app. So the verification there is that you'll click, yes, I want to make this payment of $55 to this recipient, and that will be in the checkout, the e-commerce environment. You will then be presented with an option to choose who you bank with. And at that point, all that will happen is that your cell phone, your smartphone will open up the banking app and that payment will be in there, completely pre-populated. You've not entered any information about the recipient. You've not entered any of your own banking information. Essentially, all you're doing is saying, I'm going to pay £55 to this particular merchant, and you're authorizing that in the banking app. So super secure. And no data to lose, no data to misenter,
Got it.
and a
And
lot more
then
convenient.
obviously, as far as a cost comparison, can you kind of give us a high level cost comparison?
Broadly, in the 90% cheaper than a card transaction. So again, it depends on who you're 90%, that is. So, between 90 and 95%, depending on who you're using. With Wonderful, what we're doing is, because we came from that background of creating this solution for a completely free online giving platform, then that's remained our absolute non-negotiable. So for charities, we will charge nothing, and we never will. Prior to open banking, obviously, what we were doing was reclaiming the cost of that from a corporate sponsor.
Sure.
Open banking has meant that with the obligations on our corporate sponsors are now much, much less, and we can reach many more charities, donors, and fundraisers. So that's great, but it will always be free with Wonderful. But with our commercial customers, we've moved from the typical fees associated with card processing, and if you look at those in the UK with some of the major providers, they're in the regions of 1.4% per transaction plus 20p. That will be a typical headline rate, 20 pence per transaction, 1.4%. We've removed entirely the percentage of transaction value from that fee, and we've taken that 20p down to 1p. So it's a penny a transaction with no percentages. So that gives you a sense of, in our scenario, it's probably a lot more than 90% saving.
So the reality is, it's really just volume is the driver to making everything work.
Yeah. And of course, that's an area where you can be fairly confident there's a lot of volume because of the amount of transactions that are just happening every day.
So let me ask, where have you launched so far, and what kind of response have you had from the market?
We've launched only in the UK at the moment. We've probably
Okay,
got 5.5 million small businesses in the UK to go at. I wish that we had them all as customers at the moment, but that's the volume of SMEs that
sure,
we've got to go at. So it's a massive market. We've been focused very much up until this point on the charities. So we went, 2016 we were cards, 2020, mid 2020, I think we moved to open banking with a third party provider. Then we got our own financial conduct authority license. So that took best part of a year to be able to do this, because obviously you need to be authorized to provide
sure,
this kind of service. So it's only fairly recently we've started launching our commercial services. The first integration that we've done with an e-commerce platform is with WooCommerce on the WordPress websites.
sure.
So that's available now for merchants in the UK, and then we hope to roll out a lot more integrations with other platforms, both in the UK. In the first instance, probably from the UK, we'll look at EU markets, because that
Sure.
makes a lot of sense, and open banking is very well developed and established in the EU. And I think North America, Canada, again, very, very established, but US is probably going to be a little bit longer just because of the regulatory piece.
Got it. Okay. Well, WooCommerce was not a bad first step, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I'm sure Shopify is in your crosshairs. So let me ask you. Obviously, at a high level, the fees are a big difference. How about cash flow? Like in terms of merchants, is this offering a difference in terms of cash flow, for a merchant?
Absolutely. So what you're seeing with an open banking payment, they're often called instant payments because effectively that's what they are. This is near real time as you're going to get. When we demo this technology on a stage in a live environment, we'll often have somebody with one smartphone on one side of the stage being the merchant and someone on the other side of the stage being the consumer. And the reason we like to do that is typically with a mobile banking app, there'll be a little ping as the transaction's received, and you will see that from the moment consent is given to make that
Mm,
transaction to the money being in the merchant's account is typically a second or
right.
or instant. So there's no longer waiting for 3 or 4 days for the money to come through from your card provider. Um, and we've seen, in the charity sector, sadly, we've seen much longer times than that. Sometimes it's 30 days, sometimes it's 45 days. I think one of the very big providers, it's 90 days settlement time.
Yeah,
And
no,
if
that
you're in a
is
charity running an appeal, that
so
becomes
it's
really super important.
lower cost, faster in terms of cash flow. What can you tell us about fraud and risk and all of that?
Well, one of the beauties, as I mentioned, is if you think about open banking in terms of how you're authenticating that payment, it's much, much lower risk because you will use typically biometric data to make that. In order to open your mobile banking app, then you're going to use face recognition or fingerprint recognition. One analogy I often give is if you leave your wallet in a bar in London, then someone can do quite a lot of damage in an hour and a half just using contactless payment. And okay, you may be able to recover those payments because you've reported your card as missing quickly, and the bank's going to support you in that. But there's a hassle factor. Now, with an open banking payment, unless someone steals your mobile phone and walks around with you verifying every time they make a transaction that you're going to open your mobile banking app and confirm that, then it's clearly not going to work. So the biometric is a massive reduction in fraud.
Very nice. Now, as far as the solution, is your customer the merchant, or is your customer the actual individual doing the transaction, or is it both?
Our customer's the merchant, but there's going to be huge opportunity for consumers as well, I think. But we're charging the merchant, and therein I think lies another important point to explore, Michael, because a lot of people say to us, well, we can understand why a merchant would want to use this technology. It's going to save them a fortune, the settlement's going to be instant, but how do you drive consumer adoption? Because a consumer at a checkout on an e-commerce website, they just want to get through that kind of the fastest way possible. So
Sure.
we'll often come back and say, well, that reduced friction is going to be a good thing. But if you've never used open banking before, how do you get someone over the line to use open banking the first time? And I think in our scenario with Wonderful, we're going to be relying to an extent on the work that we do in the third sector and that tech for good heritage that we have to convince consumers to give this a go. And actually, that's been really important in launching this product, and the fact that we did do this in the third sector because we had to. I mentioned we wanted to remove this ceiling on our impact and reach. So we took the decision, and we wouldn't advise merchants to do this, but we took the decision to replace card payments completely with open banking. So the only way you can make a donation through our online giving platform is using open banking.
Sure.
Now, that proved to be a really good thing because in that scenario, it's allowed us to really educate and inform people about how easy it is to use it, because we don't give them an alternative.
Right.
If I'm running a marathon and I say to you, Michael, would you support me? And I don't give you anywhere else to support me, then you're probably going to go, do you know what? I've never done open banking before, but Kieron's running a marathon. Let me give him $20.
Sure.
So that's been a really great way for us to get that information piece over. What we've typically seen then, and this is typical in the industry generally, is there's a 90% return rate. So once you've done your first, you'll go back, because why wouldn't you? But I think that becomes quite an important point in who is our market, because I think once we've established the use of this, then we can do all sorts of other things along that third sector piece with our own app, for example. So we could do things like, okay, every transaction that you make that's over a certain threshold, you might make a donation to a charity of your choice, and we'll
Sure.
initiate that and help you with that.
And you obviously have the background to make
Yeah.
that happen. So we have a lot of investors and the like that do listen to our podcast, and clearly, it's one of those no-brainer. This makes a lot of sense. It's clearly going to be successful. I hope you remember my name a few years from now. But I guess at a high level, what type of barriers to entry for a new startup that we're starting tomorrow, trying to replicate what you've done? What's your moat? What is the competitive advantage?
I wouldn't want to put anyone off, because I'm always keen to help people get started, and I think it's great. I think the beauty of this market is immense. It is really immense. Just the volume of transactions that are happening means there's space for more than one provider, and that's a great thing. I think it's high time we had some real competition in payments, because it's been dominated for so long by a couple of very large players.
Sure.
That said, don't underestimate the authorization piece. We went into that expecting it to take maybe 3 to 4 months. As I said, it took probably a year. We came out of that thinking, it's fantastic that it was so rigorous. I actually finished that process with a lot of rounds of questions from the FCA about how we were doing things and so on. And you came out of that thinking, well, if I was looking at that as a consumer, I'm really pleased that it's as rigorous as it was, and it's great that it was. But I think, if you are looking at this as an easy route into startup life, there are probably easier ones to take.
Yeah, no, I got you. So let me ask, and I'm sure, being financial services, a lot of relationships are confidential, but can you share an example of a merchant story, where they've used the platform and how it kind of fit into their ecosystem of payments?
One of the ones that I will share is one that was shared with us via Open Banking, the entity. So the entity that kind of steers now, called Open Banking Limited, but it was the Open Banking implementation entity. And they came along to a session that we were holding for WooCommerce developers, because that's quite a nice route to market for us, is the guys that are developing WooCommerce stores for various clients.
Sure.
And one of the bits of information they shared with a fairly big provider in the UK of building services. So it's a builder's merchant, effectively selling all the tools and bits of kit and so on that builders use. Very big one in the UK. And they said there were a couple of points that were really, really important to them in adoption of open banking. But the key one was when they were looking at their own data and saw that the cost of processing payments had now reached 10% of net profit. And that was the point that they went, something really has got to give. This is just crazy. And that's always been my view. I think clearly there's a cost associated with operating the business, but it's always felt that taking a share of revenue or taking a share of a donation, it just doesn't sit comfortably. With me, it's kind of charge a fee for the transaction. That's fair, but that's hard work, hard earned income for people that you're taking 1.4% of.
Absolutely. No, and that makes a lot of sense. As far as the open banking market at this point, can you give an example? Like, are there other competitors that are in this space now, or startups, or what does the competitive landscape look
Oh,
like?
absolutely. There are a number of fairly large players in the UK, and other countries as well. There are definitely some fairly big names out there in this space. One of the big evangelists for open banking in the UK is our equivalent of IRS, so HMRC, Majesty's Revenue and Customs, use an open banking provider to process all of the tax payments and including your fines if you're fined for tax evasion.
I love it.
But pretty much any tax that you want to pay, you can now pay through open banking. And the millions of pounds they've saved UK taxpayers by processing the payments using open banking is astonishing. And also the adoption that we've seen over the last 3 to 4 years since they first introduced that is amazing as well. So yeah, this is starting to gain real traction now.
Some momentum. Got it. And when did you launch in your current form that you actually are at right now? Like,
So right now, the WooCommerce integration was, I'm going to say completed, but to be honest, we keep iterating on it. So we're trying to make that user journey from the consumer's point of view, just make that tighter and tighter. But it was first launched probably about 3 or 4 months ago, so it's that new.
got it. Okay. And if you were to look at the solution that Wonderful has today and bullet point a couple of details that you feel, really make the solution very unique and provide a lot of value for merchants and consumers, what would those couple of bullet points be?
We've got probably 5 key points that we would say. Simple, and it's simple both in terms of integration for the merchant and clearly simple for the consumer to use. So we want them to be through checkout in as few steps as possible. For the
Sure.
merchant to integrate, certainly with WooCommerce, we're putting together a video at the moment. We've got a video already that shows the speed of payment, but we want to show that you can start a free trial and be live on a WooCommerce website within probably 2 minutes. That's the intention from literally starting that trial to being able to take payments.
Wow, that's
So
fantastic.
simple from both sides of the coin. It's fast, and again, from getting through checkout to also getting paid, which is really
Right?
really important. Security we've talked about already. I think the instant settlement is really, really key for businesses. We hear all the statistics about businesses' cash flow being the killer, particularly for small businesses. Not that they've not got
Sure.
a successful model; it's just literally they need cash. And then the fifth for us is always around that, the tech for good heritage, and the fact that when I look at this, I think about how we got started, and we saw that virtuous circle of donors, charities, and fundraisers, and thought, can we create a fundraising platform that sits in the middle? When we look at what we're doing now, we're saying that virtuous circle has increased to include not only the fundraising platform, its corporate sponsors, but now retailers and merchants as well. And the way that we we kind of taglined that up was to say, you don't need to run the marathon anymore. You can just buy or sell the trainers, or the sneakers, as you call them in the States.
Sure, sure. Now I know you had a nice little demo for us that I think will. What do they say? A picture is worth a thousand words, right? So let me ask you if we can run that demo. That'll give everyone a good good understanding of
Please.
how the solution works. Wonderful.
Absolutely.
I think
So
that
there you go.
demonstrates things, yeah, very clearly. And to be honest with you, at a high level, I think the name is very fitting. It's perfect. It's really neat.
Yeah, no, it is great. It's lovely to see, and I think the beauty of that video is, in a sense, that goes beyond the e-commerce environment. This is literally, and in an e-commerce environment, a lot of that will be just missed completely because all you're doing is the second part, tapping and authorizing the payment, and you're away. What we're demonstrating in that video is almost a small business that may be remote from their customers. My scenario here would be, a plumber's finished a job. She gets home from work and says, "I'm going to bill that customer for the work I've just done today." Opens the app, sends through that payment link, and that money is in her account within a few seconds. So, a
Yeah,
couple of things going on there that are important.
yeah, very important because obviously for a small business, their day doesn't end when the day ends. So anything you
Exactly.
can do to make that more streamlined is great. So what do you see as for open banking at a high level as the future? Where do you think things are heading as far as open banking, e-commerce, and the like?
I think one of the stats that I was only today reading, and it kind of blew my mind a little bit, was in Brazil, instant payments using a technology called Pix, introduced by central bank in Brazil there, uses exactly the same kind of approach. Didn't exist at the start of COVID, now accounts for 8.1 billion transactions a quarter, which is actually outstripping cards, debit cards, and credit cards combined. So that's for me the future. That's still operated from what I can see on a percentage of transaction basis, albeit a much, much lower percentage of transaction. But for me, factoring in what is possible now through open banking, and in some ways, I think it's an opportunity that should be seized. That we have now the first chance to move away from that percentage model into a fairer, more equitable cost for providing that service. But I think that speaks volumes about what can be achieved everywhere using this technology. I think it's only got upside. I don't see any downside at all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, you're an evangelist for something that just makes a lot of sense. And I think it's something that we'll see continue to grow in popularity. Obviously, you highlighted a few of the recent innovations that you've brought to market. Are there other big things on your roadmap that you're working on that you'd like to highlight for people that are listening?
Absolutely. So, I remember listening to a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and it was I think it was Mac Break Weekly. It was one of the Apple podcasts, if I remember rightly.
Sure.
And they were talking about the introduction of the first iPhone and saying, how revolutionary it was. And we look back at it now and go, well, it didn't even have copy and paste. It's incredible. that doesn't change the fact that it completely transformed the smartphone market, completely revolutionized it, and now everyone's smartphone looks like that. For me, it's a similar position that we're in with open banking now. It is almost like that first version of the iPhone. So there are lots of technical changes and things that are going to happen, innovations with open banking over the next few years. But we are at that point of, inching towards an absolute revolution. In terms of our own business, I mentioned earlier on that we have, well, there are two aspects to this. So there's the account information service permissions that we have, which allow us to do things like read account information, obviously with the consents in place from the consumer to do that. But that would give us an opportunity to do things like look at the best rates for loans that are out there amongst different banks, or look at the different products that they have on offer and do an independent presentation of those to a user to say, which do you want to choose here? So that's a typical use of account information services. We also have that payment initiation service permission that allows us to do the transactions that we've demonstrated. Now, we've been hugely focused on the payment side. We've not even started to look at the account information services opportunities, but there are massive opportunities around there that we can start to explore.
So
I think we're going to see
a lot of new possibilities.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And for merchants that are looking to get started with open banking and want to learn more, about the wonderful solution, what's the best way to get up and running and to get started?
Well, our website is available at wonderful.co.uk, so that's quite easy to find. In the UK, the charity giving site is wonderful.org. And for, again, completely independent view of how open banking works, I'd have a look at the open banking website itself in the UK or equivalents. But open banking, I think, is on openbanking.org.uk, if I remember rightly.
Perfect.
But that will give your listeners and viewers a really good overview of how it works, how the technology works.
Yeah, and we'll leave links in the show notes so that anyone that's interested in taking the next step can do so. But I think that was really a very informative overview of a topic that a lot of people do not know about, and obviously something that's emerging and clearly going to be a big part of everyone's life in the years to come. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Coming up on our next episode, we have Ovi Negrin. He's a serial entrepreneur and the founder of Social Bee, an all-in-one social media management platform for small business and solopreneurs. After struggling to efficiently manage social media for a previous failed startup called Nugget, Ovi built Social Bee in 2016 to simplify scheduling, posting, and reporting across platforms that we're all familiar with, like Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. The company has grown to over 20 team members and has just passed $1 million in annual recurring revenue. And that's going to be on our next episode. So that's one to tune in to listen to next week. Be sure to visit our website, softwareoasis.com, to access our free weekly software newsletter and sign up for our upcoming 2024 software webinar series. So once again, Kieron, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you. My pleasure again. Thanks, Michael.